Hi, this is Mike from Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and on today's video we'll be taking a look at MSI's B450-A Pro Max Edition and some reasons why you might consider buying one now in 2021. Keep watching to find out more. Okay, so in today's video we'll be taking a look at MSI's B450-A Pro Max. This is a revamped version of the original -A or -A Pro or Pro-A, whichever way you want to call it. So this has now got the increased facility to flash the BIOS very easily from the BIOS flashback button. Now essentially that is pretty much the only difference. The BIOS file size itself is a little bit bigger and the actual BIOS itself is bigger to take on all those extra SKUs available in the AMD pipeline. This board is suitable, believe it or not, for pretty much most chips that AMD have ever made, apart from some of the very low-end ones, some of the A series and the X4 series, but other than that, first gen, second gen, third gen, pretty much all of them will work with this almost out of the box. So this particular board, if you're looking at building a slightly older system, or maybe if you've just seen this available online or from things like eBay or Facebook Marketplace and you've seen it at a relatively good price, then it might well be worth snapping one of these up to get your system up and running in these crazy 2021 times where everything seems to be overly inflated and ultra expensive. So in the video today we'll be going through doing a product tour, unboxing, all that kind of stuff, and look at some of the features of the board, and then we'll sum up at the end with my recommendations and really who this board is designed for and really who it isn't. So starting off with the packaging, yeah, pretty much MSI's regular packaging. This model is part of their kind of Pro series, so essentially most of the frills have been taken away, but at the core of the board you've still got all those great features. You've actually got a really good VRM setup on here, which in effect is essentially the same as the Tomahawk version of the board, which is a pretty much legendary board, although in some cases I still possibly wouldn't recommend that board. It is still quite expensive, but certainly again, going back to what I said earlier, if you can find one of these on the used market, then definitely worth taking a look at. I actually picked this one up off of Amazon of one of their warehouse deals and managed to pick this up for less than £60, which for a B450 board at the moment is actually pretty decent value for money. Looking at the B550 range, you'd be lucky to get a decent micro ATX board for that kind of money, whereas this is a full fat ATX board and is pretty good board. So as you can see from the box itself, it is obviously a B450 chipset motherboard. It is the -A Pro Max B450 chipset and slightly older now, but as you can see on the bottom, suitable for Ryzen, and it's Ryzen 3000 series ready straight out of the box. So if you are considering getting one of these and you are worried about what processor is going to work, so essentially 1000 series, 2000 series and 3000 series will all work straight away without any BIOS modification. If you're buying this with a view to installing maybe a 5000 series processor, that is then when you'll be looking to use the BIOS flashback routine, which we'll be going into in full depth in a video which you can link to up here. We will also at some point be going through and doing a complete BIOS tour of this particular board, so if you want to go through the individual features of the BIOS in both the advanced and normal modes, then again that will be also available from the cards up there or from the video description below. Moving around to the side of the box, it goes into a little bit more detail about what processors are actually supported. So as I said previously, so the A series and the Athlon X4s, not supported on this one unfortunately, but pretty much everything else, so first, second and third gen AMD Ryzen processors, AMD processors with Vega graphics and APUs, all those kinds of things. I'll put a close-up of this on the screen so you can see exactly what it covers. Also, I'll put a close-up on the screen of some of the specifications which are printed on the tag. Moving around onto the back of the box, we've got some of the other promoted features. So we've got the steel slot, which is pretty much the norm these days, but it's nice to see it anyway. So you have got a steel supported PCI Express slot for transportation purposes, that kind of thing. Also support for AMD Crossfire. Yeah, probably less said about that, the better. Also you've got audio boost, and on this you've got the ALC 892 chipset, so 7.1 surround sound straight out of the box. Also, you've got DDR4 boost. Now, the DDR4 boost is something which is going to be a bone of contention for some of you. So depending on what processor you're going to be using on this particular board will depend what sort of frequencies you're likely to get from your XMP straight away. So if you're using a first or second gen processor, so maybe like a 2600, that sort of thing, realistically, you're most likely to get up to around about 3200 megahertz out of your RAM. If you're going for a 3000 series processor, then it's most likely it's going to top out around about 3466, which ideally 3600 is the sweet spot for those processors. Your mileage may vary depending on the RAM and how well the motherboard goes with it, and also the memory controller on the chip. You may or may not get those speeds. When you're moving up to the latest 5000 series processors, etc., you may find yourself getting up to the heady heights of 4133 megahertz on your RAM. Again, your mileage will vary. Essentially, what I would say to most people is if you're a 1000 series processor or 2000 series processor, set your expectations around about 3200. If you're a 3000 series, you might get 3600. Realistically, probably best to stick it to 3200. But if you're going with the latest and greatest, then really it's down to luck of the draw. As this is a slightly older board now, BIOS updates, that kind of stuff, are becoming less and less frequent. So yeah, your mileage will vary. If you're looking at putting a 5000 series processor and spending a lot of money on high frequency RAM, realistically, you probably shouldn't be buying this board, or for that matter, any of the B450 range. Also, we've got things like Core Boost, which is essentially precision boost overclocking. Also, this board does support overclocking in its various formats. So you've got multiplier and B clock, F clock, all that kind of stuff. So this is one of the big step ups. If you are in a moment on an A320 motherboard, or perhaps you're looking at an A520 motherboard, which is going to be very limited on overclocking. Precision boost overclocking is pretty much the most you're going to get out of it. If you do want to squeeze that little bit of extra performance out of your slightly older AMD processor, the B450 is definitely going to be a viable option over the A520 or obviously the A320. Also, you've got a turbo M.2 slot, so that will take PCI Express Gen 3 drives up to ×4 speeds. Unfortunately, no support for PCI Express Gen 4 as this is an older chipset. Obviously, you can install those particular drives, but you just won't get the throughput on them. And moving down to the bottom for the I/O, so we've got a pretty decent I/O. We'll take a closer look at that when we take it out of the box. As always with these boards, if you want the full spec on it and you want to go through it in greater detail, I'll put some links in the video description to MSI's website and you can go through their current details. And also I'll put links in there for BIOSes and all that kind of stuff. So let's go through the box and see what we actually get. Now, I did say at the beginning, this is an Amazon warehouse deal. So if you're buying this as a brand new product, your packaging may differ slightly. But from what I can see, from what I've already looked at, it looks like we've got everything that should be included. So we've got the board itself, which we'll put to one side for now. Also we get, which is quite important, at least for a lot of us, is the I/O shield. Underneath the packaging we've got pretty much the usual deal here. So we've got the case standoff notification, so that basically helps you not put the wrong pillars underneath your motherboard and prevent short circuits and that kind of stuff. You get a quick installation guide, but if you want to know how to install an AM4 processor onto an AM4 board, then there's a video you can click on up here. Also, we get a pair of SATA connections, so these are SATA 3 or 6 gigabit per second, and you get one straight cable and one with a 90-degree bend. Also, you get the MSI pamphlet for their True Gaming, which basically is trying to flog you other stuff. You get a thank you for purchasing an MSI product and also product registration details. And last of all, you get a DVD with all the, well, I was going to say with all the latest drivers and updates on, but being this B450, that isn't likely. And last we get a MSI True Gaming logo, so you can stick that on the front of your case to show that you've got some MSI goodness inside your PC. So let's go ahead and take a look at the motherboard. So starting off in the top left hand corner, as we generally tend to, so we've got a 8-pin power connector. Now obviously if you've got a slightly older processor, maybe a 3000G, that kind of thing, then certainly if you want to, you can just get away with just using a 4-pin power connector. If you have got the ability to use an 8-pin and you're using a slightly more higher wattage processor, then I would certainly recommend plugging that in. Surrounding that power connector, we've got our VRM heatsinks, which actually look pretty decent. I'm not too sure about the silver accents on there, but certainly they do look pretty chunky. And from what we can tell from previous testing and other reviews of this board, this does actually very well and is very comparable to, like I said before, the MSI B450 Tomahawk board. Regarding the VRM, we've got a 4-phase VRM on here, which by today's standards isn't fantastic, but certainly is a relatively decent VRM, and again, very, very similar to the Tomahawk boards, so you shouldn't have any problems. Realistically, when it comes to overclocking, 3900X would probably be where I would limit it with some decent cooling. Realistically, for other processors, 3600s, 2700s, that kind of thing, it's going to be absolutely fine. The 3950X and obviously the 5000 series alternatives of that, again, really aren't suited for this particular board. You really do require extra phases and a much more beefier VRM for those particular chips, especially if you want to overclock them. In the middle, we've got our standard AM4 socket, which is usual with the retention clasp on there. Again, if you want to see how to install a processor, the links will be in the video description and also in the top corner there. Moving across, we've got our CPU fan header, so that's a 4-pin PWM. You can, if you want to, connect up a pump. So if you've got an AIO cooler, you can plug a pump in there. All of that is configurable in the BIOS again, which we'll be taking a look at in a separate video. RAM-wise, you've got the ability to install up to 128 gigs of RAM on here. Again, RAM speeds and RAM compatibility are going to depend mostly on your processor. If you're not too sure what RAM is compatible with your particular setup, please do let us know in the comment section below, and I do promise I'll try and answer every single one of your questions. Moving into the top corner here, which is another bone of contention with some of MSI's B450 motherboards, is our J RGB connector. Now don't get confused, it's not a J rainbow connector, which is for addressable RGB. This is your regular good old run-of-the-mill 12 volt RGB, so red, green, blue, or combinations thereof. So no chasing patterns, none of that stuff, just you can have things like the rainbow fade, so it changes color, but you don't get any of those chase effects. So if you are looking to set up your system with nice blingy addressable RGB fans and maybe in an RGB case with all those kind of features, this unfortunately isn't going to do that. If you're going to buy something like the Corsair system and you're going to go into IQ with those fans, then that's absolutely fine. You can still control those through your USB headers on the bottom. But if you've got your mind set on addressable RGB, again, this is probably not the board for you. Moving across, we've got a pump fan header. Again, with the pump fan header, you can configure that separately. So you can have it for volt DC or PWM, or you can change it so it basically works like a normal fan header. Also, you've got system fan header 3, so that you can plug in some of your front fans. So if you've got a case with plenty of fans at the front, you can use those connectors there. Moving down, we've got the debug LEDs. These are really helpful, especially if you are considering flashing your BIOS and putting in a 5000 series processor, or maybe you're doing your first build and you're a little bit unsure of if everything's done right. The debug LEDs will certainly help you. So they go through the process of CPU, RAM, VGA, and then boot. So that gives you a really good step-by-step guide of what components are actually working in your build. Next up, we've got our 24-pin power connector, which is pretty much standard these days. And just below that, we've got another one of our system fan headers. Again, voltage DC or PWM control via the BIOS, or also from the Redragon software if you want to install it. Moving across, we've got our M.2 slot, and that supports both NVMe drives and also standard SATA SSDs. So if you want to, you can use those. Again, due to the limitations of the B450 chipset, depending on what processor you put on there, will depend in some instances on what speed you'll get from your drive. Now, if you're installing maybe a 3000G, that kind of thing, something with Vega graphics, because of the way that the PCI Express buses are divided up, then this slot is going to suffer slightly and will only give you PCI Express Gen 3 x 2 throughput. But for pretty much all the other processors, you'll be looking at PCI Express Gen 3 x 4 speeds. If you are using this particular slot, then you will lose the ability for ports on the SATA, which is ports 5 and 6, so they are shared through the bus. So if you want to utilize all 6 of those, then you won't be able to use the NVMe slot, and obviously variations of. You have got the extra 4 ports there, so it isn't the end of the world, but certainly do be wary of it depending on your configuration. Another downside of the B450 chipset and this particular board in general is the fact we've only got one M.2 slot. A lot of us these days are used to seeing more than one, or a separate slot for maybe a Wi-Fi card, that kind of thing. But unfortunately, there is just the one on this particular one. It is in a pretty nice position as well, being above the GPU slot. So if you do need to make any modifications or remove it, it's nice and easy to access without taking out the graphics card. And also you don't get the kind of heat wash that you would normally associate with a M.2 slot being below. Therefore, it doesn't need to have one of those heat sinks built in, because you should be getting a bit of airflow from the front of the case and potentially from your cooler here, blowing air around this VRM section and the M.2 drive. Moving across slightly from that, we've got another system fan header, so that is for your rear case fan, or maybe an AIO, again, voltage DC or PWM control available in both BIOS and the Redragon software. Moving down, so we've got the SATA ports that we talked about, so you've got 4 ports sticking outward and you've got 2 there at the bottom. So again, you can use whichever you want. 5 and 6, the ones which will be disabled if you're using the M.2 drive, are those 2 there. Otherwise, all of those at the bottom there will be fine. Got a heatsink over the actual chip there as well for the south bridge, or chipset, I guess, whichever you want to call it now. Southbridge is probably an old school term nowadays. Moving down to the I/O at the bottom, so this is our front panel connector, so for reset switch, power switch, hard drive LED, all that kind of stuff, you can use that. Also above there's one for speaker output. Moving along, we've got our USB 3.0 port, so you can plug in a USB 3 front header panel into that one there. Next to that, we've got our first of our USB 2.0 ports, so there's two of those next to each other. Also, we've got another system fan header. There's actually plenty of system fan headers on here, so we have got in total 5. So you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Moving just slightly up from that, we've got our CMOS battery. So if you are doing a BIOS flash or things like that, or you need to reset the CMOS, you can just flip that battery out. Again, nice distance between that and the graphics card, so you should be able to get easy access should some of your overclocking settings go wrong, that kind of thing. And right next to that is the BIOS reset or switch. If you're into overclocking, you can always, if you wanted to, hook up your reset switch to that, so you can have a quick option to reset the CMOS when you're overclocking, which is quite handy. Next to that, we've got our trusted platform module header, so you can plug into there, and there is the case opening module, so if you want to set that up in BIOS, so you'd be notified if someone tries to open the case, you can connect that up also. Moving along, some of our older fashioned stuff here, so if you've got a system where you need a serial port or an old-fashioned printer port, then you've got both of those there which you can attach headers to should you need to. And at the very end there, we've got our HD audio front panel connectors. Moving up, we've got our PCI Express ×1 slots. You've got 2 there and 2 there. Also, we've got another PCI Express 16 size slot, but that is going to run, well, considerably slower depending on the processor and due to the chipset limitations, etc. Realistically, I would suggest probably avoiding SLI or Crossfire on this kind of setup. It's never been the most reliable, although saying that with graphics card pricing how it is at the moment, you may find a slight boost in some games, although Crossfire and SLI generally tend to be very hit and miss depending on the game and the setup. Moving up, we've got some Nippon capacitors there for the audio, and also again we've got a Realtek audio chip, which is the Realtek 892 chipset, which will provide you up to 7.1 surround sound. So I think that's pretty much it for the tour of the connections. Let's take a look at the rear I/O. So on the rear I/O, we've got some interesting features, at least for B450 anyway. So in this top section, we've got the BIOS flashback button, which a lot of you will probably come to rely on, especially when you're considering upgrading. So if you're buying this as new and you're also buying it with maybe a Ryzen 5 5600X, that kind of thing, or something along those lines, a newer processor, then you can use a USB drive in this bottom slot here, press the button and flash a new BIOS so it's compatible with your new chip. Also, you've got again 2 USB 2.0 ports and a combo keyboard mouse port. You've got VGA outputs and also DVI. Now these are going to be dependent on the processor you're using or the APU you're using. If you're using a standard Ryzen 3, Ryzen 5, Ryzen 7 or Ryzen 9, then those don't generally tend to have integrated graphics. So these ports will be null and void. If you're using an APU, such as again like the 3000G, 2200G, 3200G, etc., etc., then depending on the chip, you'll be able to get advantage of either VGA, DVI, or the HDMI. And the HDMI actually supports HDMI 2.0B, so that can give you pretty much up to 4K 60Hz, which is yeah, pretty nice. Next up, we've got 2 USB 3.2 ports, or 3.0 ports, super speed, however you want to look at it. It's USB 3 is quite confusing at the moment, but anyway, so you've got 2 super speed ports there. Then these 2 here are actually Super Speed Plus, or the 10 gigabit per second ones. Again, some of it's going to come down to the processor that's mounted, but essentially consider it USB 3.0. Moving up, we've got the Realtek 8111H chipset, so that is for gigabit LAN, also backwards compatible with 10100, etc. And then we've got our 7.1 audio, which I'm really pleased to see has actually got the correctly color-coded ports on there, which I really appreciate. So you've got your pink for the microphone, green for your headphones, blue for line, and the others are for your surround sound setup. So yeah, nice and easy to work out which is which when you're struggling around the back of your PC. So that is pretty much it for a tour of the board and some of the features. Again, if you've got any comments or questions, please do let us know in the comment section below. Let's look at some of the pros and cons of this. So pros wise, cheap and a relatively decent VRM. So even if you're looking for an older processor, maybe you can pick up a older 2600 for a good price, stick it on here, and you can probably overclock the snot out of it and not run into too many problems as long as you've got some relatively good cooling. Okay, so that is a tour of the board. Let's take a look at some of the pros and cons. So pros, obviously, potentially price. You could pick one of these up very cheaply. Again, Amazon Warehouse, really good place to look. Facebook Marketplace, all those kinds of things as a used board, you can probably pick this up 40, 50, maybe £60. Again, I paid £60 for this from Amazon Warehouse, which actually seems like a pretty decent value for money. Brand new, goes for around about £80, which again, for a B450 with a relatively good VRM, isn't bad at all. You could quite easily put a Ryzen 5 2600 on here and overclock the hell out of it and get some really good performance out of it. Alternatively, you pick up a really cheap processor, stick it on there, and maybe turn it into some sort of mining rig. Again, choice is entirely yours. So that is one of the primary benefits, I would say. Price, it is one of the cheaper boards on the market, but still has a pretty decent VRM, so for those lower range processors, it's going to be absolutely fine. Also, obviously, round about that sort of price point, to have 4 memory slots can be a bonus. Plenty of fan headers, so cooling isn't going to be an issue. Where it does run into some problems for me, some of the downsides, if I'm being particularly picky, would be the colour of the board. There is a definite brown tinge to this. It would be really nice if it was just a jet black board. I think that would tie into a lot of systems much nicer, but this is designed as a professional grade board, so generally PCs which are tucked away, hidden out of the way, and just used as workhorses, so you can't really be too harsh on it. Another thing which could potentially put people off is the 12 volt RGB being really an old-fashioned RGB standard these days. Again, if you're using IQ or a separate device, separate controllers, that kind of stuff, like maybe a set of the up here fans, then they use their own controller, so generally that isn't going to be a deal breaker. But for some people, we've known from comments that people have bought this board, then tried to put it into a relatively modern case, tried to hook up the addressable RGB, and realised that they can't with this board. So again, that is something that I would certainly consider. Other downsides, probably some of the drawbacks of the PCI Express and the way it's handled from the B450 chipset. Again, some devices, depending on how they're configured, you may not get the full speed out of them. Certainly graphics cards, as we're moving forward into PCI Express Gen 4, even though it doesn't seem to make a great deal of difference now, it possibly could do at a later date. Again, this board is not aimed at cutting edge technology. It is designed, even when it came out brand new, it was designed for the mid-range or low to mid-range, so you're not really expected to put those kind of components on here, so I certainly wouldn't recommend that. Having said that, if you can find yourself a decent graphics card and a high-end processor at a good price and you want to stick it on a board, which will technically run, but possibly will be limited on features, then why not? Especially if you can pick it up cheap. That is what it comes down to, essentially, at the very end of the day. Pricing is going to be key on this. If you can pick it up cheap, I would certainly wholeheartedly recommend it. It's a good, solid board, decent VRM for most processors, and will do pretty well overall. And generally, if you're comparing this board with a modern B550 board in a similar price bracket, you'll probably find this will actually perform better, although lacking features. Another downside, which I'll leave to the very end because this is probably going to be a deal breaker for some, no Wi-Fi and no Bluetooth. We get a ton of questions on a daily basis for the motherboard reviews we do. Does it have Bluetooth? Does it have Wi-Fi? Now generally, if I don't mention it in the video, that means it doesn't have it. I do try and cover these pretty thoroughly, so not to try and miss out any of those features. But just to reiterate, for those of you that have missed it already, then yes, there's no Wi-Fi, no section for plugging antennas, and there isn't a chipset which will enable Wi-Fi or Bluetooth. So if you do want Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, you will need either a separate PCI Express card, which again, we've done videos on, we'll list those up the top there. And also you can pick up a cheap USB dongle, which will do exactly the same thing. Again, we'll put some links in the video description and possibly a card so you can see how those are installed. But overall, apart from those downsides, I think the main key of this is the price, the fact you can flash the BIOS from the USB stick, which is actually really simple to do. Again, we'll do a follow-up video on that. So if you want to get into PC gaming, you want to get some bits cheap and you want something to stick it all on, then yeah, I think this is a reasonable choice if the price is right. So let me know what you think of this video in the comment section. But in the meantime, I've been Mike, this is Mike's Unboxing Reviews and How To, and hopefully we'll see you in the very next video. Thanks for watching.